Hello, welcome back to Black Box. In this episode, we take a deep look into the forgotten history and supernatural landscape of Los Angeles and Old Hollywood. Our guest is Craig Owens, the author of Haunted by History, separating the facts and legends of 8 historic hotels and inns in Southern California. Craig is a photographer, researcher, paranormal investigator, and historian who weaves these various interests into stories that can be appreciated by both skeptics and believers alike. During our discussion, Craig explained his own personal thoughts on the nature of ghosts, while also retelling little-known histories of landmark places and monuments in Southern California. We focus on what he believes is one of the most haunted places in LA, the Alexandria Hotel in downtown. The immediately successful Alexandria Hotel hosted oil tycoons, film industry titans, mineral speculators, boxing promoters, and even early paparazzi in its day, but not King Edward, as previously thought by many, as Craig's research explains why this is not likely. We begin our discussion with me telling Craig why I find his work so intriguing. What you bring to this is an artistic interpretation of both folklore, urban legend, real history, and this appreciation for the aesthetic of old Hollywood. I dig it.
Right, it's a combination of everything, and it makes it real easy because in Southern California, almost all of these buildings have, a lot of them have an old Hollywood history, especially like the hotels. And I chose hotels over other places was because it was like a haunted house you could rent for about 3-4 days, like the haunted rooms. And a lot of historic landmark buildings don't really want you spending the night, there. They'll give you like 3-4 hours here or 3-4 hours there, or you go on a walking tour. But the old historic hotels, their business depends on you spending the night. And so a lot of times they will welcome you in. So what I always did is I thought, well, let's pick a slow time of the week, slow month where it's mostly out of season, try to get control of the environment and give them business for about 3-4 days. Rent the haunted rooms, have to get permission. They have to be comfortable enough with the paranormal to let us in. And then we would stage photos in those haunted spaces. I would say that 50% of it is trying to get the picture and getting a really good picture, maybe 51%. But the other 50% or 49% is just as important to me, and that's trying to see if the pictures that I was taking was actually stirring up paranormal activity. So I was actually using a paranormal theory behind even staging the photos, and it has many names. One is the Singapore theory. I don't know why it's called that. Another, one of the ghost hunting shows 10 years ago, we're calling it Eric Hughes. But the one that I like to throw out, and the phrase I like to use, is it's the theory of familiarization. And that basically is, if you're going from the point of view that this room is supposedly haunted, and you're thinking that the ghost or whatever is haunting is somewhat intelligent, you should be able to play psychological games with it. You should be able to confuse it or encourage it to come forward. And the best way to do that is to stage the urban legends about the place. Stage it. Like if someone had supposedly committed suicide over a bad romance and they hanged themselves according to the story. Well, I don't really want to get into the hanging part because that's kind of gruesome and somewhat disrespectful if it's true or not. But you can pick out elements of the story that led up to the suicide and recreate those and see what happens. Sometimes I would choose an urban legend. Sometimes I would come across a real historical, something that is verified, and want to restage it as well there. And you want to try to pick the decade and the time period where the ghost may be from. Because I'm operating under the assumption that what's haunting these places are not demons, are not angels, are not any of these peripheral things. I actually think it's a piece of history that's still lingering behind. That's the way I like to put it. It's a memory. It's something that's attached to the building. They chose that to be their final place that they want to hang out in. It's their heaven, it could be their hell. I don't know. That's what I'm here to find out. But it is a piece of history left behind. And I would have to say that in just about every case, that is my conclusion.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand this correctly, because you inadvertently answered kind of a question that I wanted to ask you, which is, when you look at ghosts or apparitions, is it something that is it self-conscious, or is it some form of impression upon the atmosphere or surroundings of the particular place, almost like a recording?
That is one of the other theories. It's called the stone tape theory, is where maybe an impression is embedded in certain materials in a building and they get triggered for whatever reason. And I'm not a big fan of that theory,
Okay.
although I do believe that I think we've been able to prove through science that crystal quartz is a mineral that stores electricity. They use it for computers. They use it for all kinds of software. Limestone also seems to be a type of stone that is absorbent of energy. So there is that part I believe in. I just find it weird that they've never really been able to trigger. All the scientists and all the ghost hunters out there have never been able to trigger this to just come forward at will. And you would think that we would have come up with something at that time. And there's some great skeptical arguments out there about, well, if you're talking about like a recording, I mean, there's a needle where you put on the record or the disc, and it's the needle that, triggers the sound. And how can sound emanate from crystal quartz? How can it emanate from limestone without something akin to a needle on a record groove to set it off? So what does set it off? Because there's not that one little appliance or that one little, sliver of metal or whatever. I lean towards that. I said, that at least makes sense to me. But I do believe that I think we may have mischaracterized what intelligent and what is residual, which residual is the stone tape theory. I'm almost under the impression that wherever there's residual or a story of residual, say people have been saying for years that a ghost, they see a woman enter a room, she crosses to a mantle and lights an imaginary candle, and then she slowly fades and disappears. And some stories will say it's midnight. Well, you hang out at midnight, she never shows up. And then you find out from others that it's not even a regular thing, it's an irregular thing, but it's always roughly the same. However, in cases like that where there's residual like that, there's usually something intelligent also haunting this place, something that moves things around, people that engages, that pulls hair, taps shoulders. This would not constitute a residual haunting.
Right.
A residual haunting is a haunting or a playback of an event or a memory that is unaware of the surroundings.
Yes.
It doesn't acknowledge anybody in space. Sometimes it's handling invisible objects. Sometimes it's handling other objects in their hands that'll disappear along with them. It's really strange, this phenomenon. However, what's to say that maybe it's the intelligent energy that's triggering the residual? Maybe it's the record needle.
Right.
Maybe it's projecting a memory.
It's a manifestation of
It's a
that.
manifestation. Yeah, it's almost like it's a projection of, say, someone that they're looking for, or someone that they used to know, someone that broke their heart, someone from the past. And maybe when you get a bunch of people in, if it senses someone might have a piece of the information, it'll project that to them. And again, I don't know. I mean, I'm still gathering facts. I could be way off. But what I did when I started my book project is I threw out everything off the table. All paranormal theory was gone except for one. And what were the hauntings somehow related to the past? And I also operated, I guess, under a second theory that ghosts are, in fact, some kind of energy form that may have been in someone's body when they were alive, like a soul.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as the religious connotations, the magic 3 a.m.,
Right.
haunting hour, the fight between heaven and hell and demons and angels, all that was taken off.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I figure portals, all the stuff that you hear, used very loosely, and
Mm-hmm.
people almost use it like they know it's real, like it's fact, like
Yeah.
it is evidence,
Yeah.
and that always bugged me because it's like, well, I don't agree with most of these portal stories at all. That has not been my experience. They could exist, but when I have enough evidence of it or data suggesting that, then I'll put it back on the table.
Mm-hmm.
So I literally stripped everything down and started rebuilding again from scratch. So, I've never come across for instance, a ghost saying, "Hey, hold that door, I'm coming through,"
Mm-hmm.
as in a portal, Never heard any mention in EVPs or which are electronic voice phenomena or anything that suggests that portals exist. Again, I could be wrong, but I haven't come across that data yet.
Let me ask you this. If ghosts exist in the facet or a loose framework that we're discussing, would it be reasonable to expect that any place that many people came and went from over a large period of time should have some ghost activity?
Yes,
Yeah.
almost in all cases.
Yeah.
Yeah, hotels are especially. The resorts, hotels back then. We're talking like late 19th century up until let's say World War II.
Mm-hmm.
They were built for a very specific purpose, and they served a different function than what a lot of hotels do today. So yes, you would get a lot of people there. If it was a successful hotel, you're bound to get deaths every now and then. But like in the case of, say, the Alexandria Hotel in downtown Los Angeles, that one had a very specific purpose. It was built to be the first five-star hotel that in Los Angeles, and it was going to be just as big as the Hotel del Coronado, just as popular, just as expensive as that, and it succeeded. In fact, it might have even been regarded in its day nicer than the Hotel del Coronado, just because it didn't have the Victorian was kind of passé by the 19 teens. The Del certainly kept bringing people in and was a great getaway, but this Beaux-Arts and Rococo architecture of the early 20th century, that was the latest thing. That was state of the art. And so the Alexandria was a little more state of the art. But there were all kinds of things that happened there. There was, if you look over the history, I mean, there was a murder that had taken place elsewhere in downtown LA, but the murder plans between this woman and this man were being hatched in an Alexandria hotel room. So you had all kinds of romantic problems, domestic violence. You did have suicides. Some people, even locally, would check into the Alexandria Hotel to commit suicide so that their husband or wife or whoever didn't have to come home and find the mess, that the hotel would take care of it. Others would come to these high profiles to end their life just so that they made the news, the newspapers. They didn't live to read it, but they knew that it would get covered. So there are all kinds of reasons why these hotels are haunted or have the potential of being haunted. There's also brighter stories. I mean, and it still happens today. People meet in a hotel, they fall in love,
Mm-hmm.
marriages take place, infidelity takes. Now we're going darker, but infidelity takes place. So yes, hotels, the larger ones, the older ones, have a huge range of emotions and experiences there. So it's not a hard stretch to determine that these places. It's no wonder that most of them are rumored to be haunted.
Mm-hmm.
There was just too much going on there.
Yeah. You talk about a breadth of emotion. And when I think of hotels, I think about the things that you're talking about: love, planning, scheming, relaxing, romance, broken hearts, overindulgence, very human experiences that are deep emotional experiences where at work, unless it's something you loved, it's only that small slice of the
Right.
human experience. And if I were a ghost, I would certainly be more attracted to a place like the Hotel Alexandria that I had been in my life than somewhere else. But you made the segue, and it was a perfect segue because this is a show about Los Angeles and Southern California. So give us the story on Hotel Alexandria. I think a lot of people will not realize the importance of this hotel in the creation of something that's very important to Los Angeles.
Oh yeah, no, out of all the hotels in Volume One, and it covers the Mission Inn, it covers the Hotel del Coronado, it covers a lot of really high profile, legendary hotels, and you go in knowing that there's going to be lots of famous people attached, a lot of history there, but the Alexandria was the one that shocked me the most at how underrepresented it is, even among Los Angeles historians. And at the time that I started research, the Wikipedia page was just ridiculous. Everything was wrong.
Is it still
And
wrong? Because I was looking at it today.
It still has some wrong things on it.
Okay.
It still has some wrong things on it. Once I started doing this book, I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to actually explain how these hotels became haunted, but I needed to fact check the history. So I was fact checking historians, not just the ghostly claims.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was shocked was I was finding all kinds of things wrong with the history. Well, I later found out that a lot of the history is speculative. And no one had really gone through and really scrubbed the records to try to connect the dots. So a lot of them that we thought were facts were actually educated guesses, and some of these educated guesses turn out to be wrong.
Is this because it's just lazy scholarship, or people just haven't been interested enough yet to get the facts right?
Maybe a little bit of both.
Okay.
Maybe a little bit of both. I mean, there's so many historical places in Los Angeles. I mean,
Sure.
I am not the expert on the Biltmore yet, but if I, ever took on the Biltmore, I would know everything about that, including when the renovations took place. I would try to find out the long list of owners. I would try to scrub the records for deaths, and same with the Hollywood Roosevelt. Some of these, in my opinion, these properties are still underrepresented by historians. But the Alexandria was nice enough to let me in. I went through the records, and there's, I must have looked at 5,000 to 7,000 articles. I was looking up everything that I could, and I was just shocked at just the sense of humor about this building and just how wild it was, and what it by the 1920s it had become a party hotel. Actually, even before then. But it was Los Angeles' first 5-star hotel. They never had one. They had a bunch of hotels that would kind of come and go after a year or so. Two guys from Pasadena decided, LA is growing into an important city now. We've got the railroads, we've got people flooding in, but we don't have a hotel that is worthy of this. So what they did, which was very unusual and probably one of the reasons why it survived to this day as a building, is that they didn't buy the land. They rented the land from property owners, and the main corner on Spring and Fifth Street
Mm-hmm.
was owned by a guy named John Alexander, hence the name Alexandria Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And then these two Pasadena guys built a hotel that they owned the hotel, but they had to pay rent to the landowners every month. So it was a very expensive undertaking, and it cost about $1 million to build the building, but then they spent another $1 million furnishing it so that it would be absolutely state-of-the-art. And when it opened...
1906, 1911, when is this?
1906.
Okay.
February 10th, 1906 is when the doors flew open and
Okay.
they let people in.
And how long did it take to build this hotel?
It was about a year.
Okay.
It went very quickly, and it was about 8 floors. The newspapers waver on how many floors there were. There were certainly basement levels, and like the Hotel del Coronado, the Alexandria had shopping right under the lobby.
Mm-hmm.
That a section, as well as its swanky Indian grill restaurant. It had noiseless doorknobs. It was the only and first and only hotel at the time to have consistent hot water. We take that for granted now, but back then that was a big deal. It was also one of the first buildings, hotel buildings, to be fireproof. That was a big concern back then, especially with earthquakes and whatnot. And the high rate of people smoking back then, that there was going to be, a lot of fires, and you didn't want to have this big upscale building that burns to the ground. So they built this fabulous hotel, and unlike the Hotel del Coronado and actually unlike the Mission Inn, it was an overnight success. It was filled up to capacity. It had about 700, not even 700 rooms, had about half that when it opened, and a lot of the people that were checking in were just wealthy Los Angelinos. It was built on the edge of a developing neighborhood in downtown Los Angeles called the Financial District. So everything, once the Alexandria took off, all of the property skyrocketed. It was already expensive when they leased the land. It became even more expensive once the hotel opened. And it immediately attracted new money and old money from across the United States. And because they didn't have Las Vegas, all the miners in Goldfield and all the gold miners up in
speculators,
and speculators, right, the ones that were pulling out all kinds of minerals, they were going to Los Angeles to wheel and deal and follow the stock exchange, visit the bankers, and find investors to keep their Goldfield mines going in Nevada. And so the Alexandria hosted a lot of those. Oil, when Edward Doheny discovered oil, he threw this lavish party. And that was one of the things that the Alexandria specialized first and foremost, was that it started the theme parties in Los Angeles. And what I mean by theme parties, it's like when Edward Doheny rented the ballroom to entertain some oil people from Mexico, politicians and whatnot, he wanted a tropical garden/forest atmosphere.
Motif.
So they literally built a lake, a small lake, in the middle of the ballroom, and it had water fountains that had different lights, so it turned green, and they had live goldfish in the lake. It was kind of like just a large pond, but they had a stage on the end. They hung ferns and brought in trees everywhere. I mean, it was like you would not recognize it as a ballroom, except for the long tables where
and
people
then they
sat
removed
and ate.
all of this after the party?
Yeah.
Wow. The ballroom, is that the main room that has the brilliant stained glass in it? Is that what you're talking about?
No, that actually came later.
Oh,
now,
okay.
what happened with the Alexandria is it was too small for how popular it became. It was the heart and soul of Los Angeles. So the owners wanted to expand it. So in 1909, they went basically to the city council. They had all kinds of power by this time, political power, and they wanted the city of Los Angeles to actually increase the height limit of the building. The original 1906 structure was as tall as a building was allowed back then, according to the law, the ordinances. So they actually lobbied and got the city council to pass another ordinance increasing it up to about 12 floors. And so they immediately built an annex, which was completed in 1911. And the annex meet the new height requirement, which is still low by today's standards in LA, but it was about 12 floors. Now, what happened is they reconfigured a lot of things when they added this new piece of land. And they did the same thing as they did before. They rented from landowners and built the building on top of it and had to pay the rent. Now, what you're talking about is now called the Palm Court, and that has the Tiffany glass ceilings. That was part of the 1911 edition. And that was actually their banquet room. It was not a ballroom.
Okay.
In fact, it had carpeted floors up until close to 1920. They opened that in 1911 just in time for President Taft's visit. That area is one of the haunted areas, supposedly, of the Alexandria Hotel. But there's this second floor ballroom that is also new to 1911. What they did is they reconfigured the old ballroom, the one where Doheny
Yes, through the party.
Right. They open a new ballroom, and this ballroom actually took up 2 floors in height. So the ceiling of the ballroom was actually the ceiling of the 3rd floor. And what they did is the 2nd floor was called the mezzanine level. And the reason why it was a mezzanine was that it wasn't a full floor. It actually was this kind of half floor where you can look down into the lobby.
Right.
And then there'd be a lot of rooms. But this ballroom was located up there. Now, this ballroom was originally called the Rose Ballroom. Nobody knew that until I came along. They were calling it the King Eddie Ballroom, because they said that
there, King
Eddie. Well, no, we never did. That's the thing.
That's a fallacy?
Yes.
Fantastic.
And that's what I uncovered in the research. And I had to, and I mean the LA Conservancy, the LA Times, the Eye on LA, all these still say this King Edward because King Edward stayed there. And it's like, no, King Edward never stayed there.
Was he even in town?
No.
And there you go, ladies and gentlemen. That's why
Not
you're
while
listening.
the Alexandria was and in its peak. No. In fact, I always tell people when the Alexandria Hotel opened in 1906, it opened the same year as the King Edward Hotel. And King Edward never set foot in that building either. So, I mean, he didn't come till much later to LA.
And no one has reviewed this since you've made this.
What happened was in the late 1960s, while the hotel was in transition, it had gone down and had become a slum hotel. Mm-hmm. There was a Greek boxing promoter named George Parnassus. He was a legend in his time. And he had taken over the Alexandria, and he had taken over the Palm Court, and he had put a boxing ring in there. And he used it as like his podium to promote his up-and-coming boxers in L.A. And he would have banquets there. But he became more or less the spokesperson for the Alexandria. Well, in the late 60s, right before he was ousted, and they redid that room so that it could become a historic landmark, he was talking to the L.A. Times, and he broke the story about the ghost of a woman that was seen haunting. And he also said that he never gave a year, but that King Edward sneaked or snuck, however you want to say it. He was in disguise. He went into the hotel and had a secret meeting with Jan Paderewski, the famous concert pianist that became Poland's prime minister a little bit later.
Now, he did this really just to generate business, right?
He did this to generate business. There was no truth to it at all, but the LA Times printed it without fact-checking, and they would know because their records never mentions King Edward, and they don't even use critical thinking skills.
This is 1960s fake news.
Yeah, I call it alternative facts.
Alternative facts, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, alternative facts. There's the paranormal is full of them.
Yeah.
But
no, come on, don't say it.
Yeah. Well,
I kid.
But anyway, what ended up happening is I fact-checked. I ran down that story. That was the first appearance of King Edward ever being associated with the hotel. Made no sense because the Alexandria was, like I said, it was the heart and soul of Los Angeles. So the LA Times and the LA Herald, they had reporters there all the time, making sure that they knew who was coming and going. And there were informants in that lobby that if anyone famous came in, whether it was John D. Spreckles, the Sugar King, or whoever, they would make a phone call and the Times would be out there. So there was no way that you could get a future king of England that would later abdicate his throne. There's no way he could have possibly sneaked into the port of Los Angeles and sneaked into the hotel to have a secret meeting.
Amazing.
It's impossible. And people forget, that was the only way Europeans could come to the United States back then. It was by ship. And if you're the most photographed man in the world, as King Edward was, there was no way he could sneak in and out of Los Angeles's port.
Well, let's roll back a little bit because that's fascinating. And I don't know what you would call paparazzi in that day, but they surely existed in some fashion.
Yes, they did.
But let's talk about the Hotel Alexandria as kind of ground zero for the film industry.
It was.
Talk about that.
Well, I actually began as early as 1910. And again, this ties back to it being in the financial district. But in 1910, Mary Pickford, her brother Jack, Max Sennett, the king of comedy, who did the Keystone Cops, and D.W. Griffith, who was like the first superstar American film director, all came to Los Angeles to escape the New Jersey winters and to scout out Southern California and possibly knock out a handful of films, which is exactly what they did. Well, they all stayed at the Alexandria Hotel on the top floor of the original 1906 building. In fact, that's really where all of the really famous people that stayed overnight, including presidents, that was the suites. That floor was it. I'd love to see that floor one day. It probably looks nothing like it did.
Let me interject for a second. So today it's apartments?
They're it's low income housing and micro lofts as well. I don't know how much longer it's going to be low income housing. I mean, it used to be one of the worst low income housing, but they've made so much improvements to it that I think it's eventually it may actually elevate a little bit above that.
A place of such historic importance, even if some of the history is not correct, and it's downtown, and it just surprised me. It's low-income housing. How much does it cost to live there?
I don't know. I've met the owners a couple of times, talked to them. I've never talked to them about that.
It's good that they're providing some shelter for low-income people, but I'm just surprised, given the capitalistic nature of all of this. It's like you would think that they would have wanted to make more money out of such an auspicious building.
Well, again, people forgot the history. People weren't aware of how important this building really was. I mean, there were some milestones that people remembered, like, in 1920, Chaplin, Griffith, Douglas Fairbanks, and Mary Pickford got together and they announced the formation of United Artists in the Palm Court, which originally was called the Franco-Italian Banquet Salon.
And I believe you recreated that photo. Is that correct?
I didn't recreate that photo. I actually found
that was a real one I saw?
Yeah, that was them signing the documents, putting United Artists into motion at the D.W. Griffith Studios in Sunset. What I created was actually more fun. It was based on a true story of a fist fight between Charles Chaplin and Louis B. Mayer in the lobby in 1920.
Were they drunk?
No, they were fighting over a woman.
Girl. Of course, as you do.
Yeah. It just happened to be Chaplin's soon-to-be ex-wife, who had been signed by Louis B. Mayer to be a star, and Louis B. Mayer was billing her as, I think it's Mildred Harris Chaplin.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlie did not want Chaplin associated with her name. He thought that Mayer was exploiting his famous name to try to throw a few bucks,
right,
and make money off of it by signing his soon-to-be ex-wife. So that's what triggered the fight.
Well, tell us about the hauntings of this hotel, because I know that people are like, all right, Parker, let's hear about some ghosts. So
yeah.
What is some of the more famous stories, true and false, of hauntings in that building?
The Alexandria, let me just preface by saying I think it's possibly the most haunted, one of the most haunted buildings, if not the most haunted of the hotel buildings in downtown Los Angeles. Maybe all of Los Angeles, but definitely downtown. I find it more active than Biltmore, certainly more than the Cecil. So, the Alexandria has a right to be haunted. It had deaths as early as the 1913, strange deaths, mind you. Now, the ghost stories started kind of circulating probably by the 1940s, 1950s, definitely 1950s. Boxers were getting spooked because they'd be in the ring, either in the ballroom or in the Palm Court area, and they'd see something or something would happen and they'd get spooked. Parnassus, when he would try to get boxing fans coming to L.A., he'd try to put them up in the hotel, say, hey, come see the fight. We'll get you a really good deal in a room up at the Alexandria, and you can see the training and meet the boxers. And so some of them probably got spooked too. Mm-hmm. So by the 60s, there was a new owner had taken over. He originally wanted to tear down the building, but he had a change of heart once the city passed ordinances where they could get money for rehabilitation. So that's when, during the renovation where they were trying to roll it back to a Victorian era time, that's when the ghost stories started going to another level. And people started seeing this lady in Edwardian clothing, black clothing, wandering the hallways. They've seen her on the second floor. They've seen her on some of the upper floors. I think they've even seen her in the basement. And
what is the origin of her story?
Well, that's what's interesting is what I tried to do is I tried to find records of every single death of that place. And unfortunately, back in the old days, they were pretty good about reporting it, when someone died. There was a woman that fits that description that was the first suicide at the Alexandria, and that was in 1915. And I don't know if it was really suicide or not. There were a lot of red flags about her death and the way it was covered by the LAPD and the LA Times. But
Gunshot, poison?
Poison. But she took like a slow-acting poison. A housekeeper heard moaning from her room the next morning.
Was she a jilted lover?
Entered to find her in agony, and her final words were something like, "I've drunk poison. I'm in so much pain. I just want to die." They found faded love letters in her possession. So the LAPD took that, her last words, as an admission of suicide, which I question whether that was an admission of suicide, because she may not have been aware. And when you're in that much pain, you could say, and she discovered after the fact that she had drank poison,
Mm-hmm.
you could say, I'm in so much pain, I just want to die. That doesn't, that could mean something else.
So you're saying that there's a possibility that that poison was administered to her, perhaps by someone who needed to get rid of her.
Like her husband
Yeah.
in San Francisco, who just happened to be a pharmacist. Nobody
Come on.
ever put two and two together. And he was trying to sue a man that he was in L.A. who he claimed was having an ongoing affair with his wife. The LA Times never bothered to fact check this woman's identity, or else they would have realized that the name that they reported in the LA Times was an alias, that she actually was another person, and that the lawsuit immediately began to unravel in San Francisco, where most of the drama was really taking place. And the husband started changing his story within days of the suicide at the Alexandria. And he began to admit that she had been a prostitute. At first he was saying that the affair took place in Los Angeles. Then he changed his story to saying that this alleged affair took place in San Francisco. Then he changed it, it was in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Los Angeles again. By the time it went to court, the defense for this man who was being sued for thousands of dollars brought out a witness and said, no, they both were grifters. They told me their whole plan on New Year's Eve. And once that witness gave that testimony, the husband's lawyers gave up. They just said, we're done. And so he lost the case.
Outstanding.
And yet there was no follow-up on this other mysterious death. So to this day, it's a suicide. But it bugs me that why would someone drink slow-acting poison? I mean, if you're going to commit suicide and you're heartbroken, why drag it out 8 to 10 hours?
And I would counter that by also saying, if you're going to kill someone, why use a slow-acting solution unless you just want to punish them? I mean, you would think, I don't want any chances of this not working.
My theory, and again, it's just a theory. I could be wrong, but being that it was a pharmacist and being that she drank it right before going to bed,
I see.
it might have been, she might have thought it was a sleeping sedative.
Got it.
Like, oh, here, take this if you have trouble sleeping.
Now, didn't you recreate this? I thought I saw a photo of a man in a bed with a black figure on the end of the bed, or was that a different
No, that's the
hotel?
Hotel del Coronado.
Oh,
I
okay.
actually
All right.
based that on the Cape Morgan, on a ghost sighting of someone claiming that they had woken up in the middle of the night and seen Cape Morgan sitting on the edge of his bed. And that's what I do is if I hear a ghost story that's very visual,
Mm-hmm.
I want to recreate it because I want to see what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times stories like that, actually it looks funny when you try to restage it.
Mm-hmm.
It takes almost like a comedic
Well,
vibe to it.
You do have a sense of humor in your work, and I think this is a good point to tell listeners: do not turn off this podcast, whatever you do, but open up another browser window and go on to Instagram and look for Bizarre Los Angeles. Craig's work is really, really good. A lot of the photos that are outtakes, I guess, for lack of a better word, from the book are in here. There's a couple of images in particular that really grabbed me. There were some photos that you did in red. Is this the Valentino room?
Yes, and
Tell me about
that's a big
this.
one that I need to get on this show because
It's gorgeous.
it's surrounded. Yes, this room. A lot of people, most people, in fact, think that Valentino actually stayed there. And some paranormal groups, this started in the 1990s, I want to say 1996, to be honest with you, started saying that the ghost of Rudolph Valentino haunts his Valentino Suite at the Alexandria Hotel. And I see this all the time. Here's the truth. The Valentino Suite was named in honor of Rudolph Valentino in 1970. No one knows or has any record of what room he stayed in. If I had to guess, he probably stayed as a guest of Norman Carey. That we do know. We do know that when Valentino first arrived, he did stay at the Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
That's documented by multiple sources. But I believe if he was staying with Norman Carey, another film star who was doing him a favor, hey, Rudy, stay with me for a while. I'll introduce you to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
He probably was staying on the top floor of the 1906 part of
Sure.
the building. That's probably where Valentino stayed as a guest, not the top floor of the 1911 building.
Right.
However, it is possible. All those records are gone, and I'm not even sure Valentino would have signed anything anyway if
Right.
he were just a guest.
He
So it
would-
was named in honor of Valentino. They just picked this room, gave it deep red wallpaper, furnished it with Victorian-looking furniture. They had hung a portrait of him in the room and put a placard on the front of the door saying, "This is the Rudolph Valentino Suite," and went with it.
Mm-hmm.
That suite still exists. It hasn't been modified too much since 1970. It's really in rough shape. But they did pick a haunted room, not probably unknowingly,
Mm-hmm.
to name it after Rudolph Valentino.
Wait a minute. You're saying the room is haunted, but not by Valentino. So
Right.
by whom?
That I don't know. I will just tell you that sometimes my shoots stir up things. And when I did my first shoot inside the Valentino Suite, I had leased that room for almost 24 hours. I was there from like 8 in the morning to about 1:30, 12:31 the next morning. And so I brought a bunch of antiques up there, and I really dressed this room much nicer than it looked. And I had even the model dressed in red. Everything was just red and powerful.
It's really
as
sexy.
you
I
can
love
get.
it.
And nothing was really going wrong inside the room until it got dark. And then after it got dark, the atmosphere got really thick and kind of gloomy. And the pictures kind of, I think, reflect that gloom. It started to come through. And so I thought, ooh, this is gloomy. I'm going to try to capture this. You know, let's capture the personality of the room. So what ended up happening is the leasing agent that was working at the Alexandria at the time, he got off work. He came upstairs because he was kind of being a pest around the set. I just gave him a spotlight, and there are two rooms making up the Valentino Suite. There was the red room where we were shooting in, and then there was a another room which had gold wallpaper, and there's this tiny, narrow little hallway that connects the two rooms. So what I did is I put him in the gold room while the rest of us were in the red room, and we were shooting, and I just told him, just shine that spotlight through that little hall onto the model, but I got him out of the way. So he's back there alone in this room for about 15 minutes, and then he says, "It's getting cold here, and it's getting creepy back here. Can you please hurry and get your shot?" And I'm like, yeah. Just hang tight. I'm getting it. I almost got it. He waits, and about 10 minutes later, a door slams in that gold room so hard and so loud that the leasing agent screams. The spotlight beam that he's shining is shaking all over the room, and we all jumped. The glass in the entire suite rattled. The old 1911 glass rattled, and we all were startled, but I was the leader, so I had to get everyone to kind of calm down and refocus. Let's get the shot. So we did, and then we went back and checked that door that had slammed, that had caused the leasing agent to scream. That door should not have slammed. That was a door we had tried to close earlier in the day, and we thought it was permanently open because the floor tiles were old. They're real old, at least 1970, if not earlier, floor tiles. There was no window in the bathroom, which was what this door led to. Mm-hmm. But the floor tiles and the floorboards were warped. So that's why the door was wedged open in a stuck position. We couldn't close the door, and even if we tried, it wouldn't budge. And I didn't want to break anything. Once I saw that it was wedged and that floor was really warped, I was like, nope, we're leaving it open. We'll just shoot around it.
Right.
Later that night, that's the door that slammed shut.
That's remarkable.
It is. I'd never had anything that dramatic happen to me prior to that. Mm-hmm. As far as sound and door slamming, I have seen doors open and close with no one on the other side, right next to me. I mean, I literally heard the doorknob turn. That's what caused me to look that way, just to see a door open and close with no wind. That happened at the Glen Tavern Inn. I saw a shadow person at the Mission Inn. I didn't even believe in shadow people. And I saw one point blank, not out of the corner of my eyes. I saw it full on, and my brain had interpreted exactly as what I thought it was, a shadow, until it darted unnaturally around a corner.
Craig, I'm like you. Whenever I've heard the term shadow people, I just kind of shined it on. You're the first person to tell me, I think, that they've seen one. So that, to me, is a strong indicator that perhaps they exist. Ladies and gentlemen, Haunted by History, Volume 1. And from what I understand, Craig, there is a Volume 2 at some point.
Volume 2, Volume 2 is mostly done. One of the things is I'm taking on in Volume 2, I'm taking on the Queen Mary. And that,
as you should, I mean,
that is large. That chapter is so large it could be its own book. But there's a lot of alternative facts that need to be addressed with this one. I've always said that the number one key to ghost hunting is not being at the location with a ghost box or an ovulus or any of these
further
gimmicky things. Yeah, laser grids. The best thing you can do. The single best thing you can do is exactly what most ghost hunters don't do, and that's research, historical research. And I get it. Most of them don't have the time. Most of them don't have the resources. That's kind of why I did my book. It's like I had the time, I had the resources. I'm doing all the footwork so that people, if they're serious about ghost hunting, if they're serious about the paranormal, they've got it out there, and it's all footnoted so that they can literally see what I see or challenge me. They can look and see the data, make sure that I connected the dots right. It takes a lot of effort to try to get these facts right, especially when you're dealing with urban legends, and you want to make sure, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this is an urban legend before you come right out and call it one.
Thank you to Craig Owens for coming into the box and leading us on this fascinating tour of old Hollywood and Los Angeles. If you want to know more about Craig's work, go to BizarreLA.com. Craig hosts frequent paranormal investigations and ghost hunts, which the public can be a part of. I intend to join him on one in the near future. Thanks for listening today, and if you like the content, please share it with your friends and family and rate and review us on your podcast medium of choice. I'm Michael Parker. Good night from Black Box.